Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Prevent Podcast. My name is Carlos Silla, and I work at Halmstad University in Sweden. I'll be your host for this episode. Today, we have the honor of speaking with Dr. Melanie Fontes-Dutra about several important topics related to extreme weather events. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Fontes-Dutra. Could you please introduce yourself for listeners who may not know you yet?
Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Fontes-Dutra. I'm a biomedical scientist, a neuroscientist. I have a master's and a doctorate in neuroscience. I also have a postdoctorate in biochemistry and virology. I'm a researcher in the area of One Health and climate change. I've also worked as a science popularizer on social media, and I'm a professor at the School of Health at Unisinos. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you.
Melanie, I saw in your CV that you conduct research on infectious diseases following natural disasters. When we think about events like floods, such as the one that affected Rio Grande do Sul in 2024, what happens to disease vectors like mosquitoes? For example, we know that dengue-transmitting mosquitoes breed in stagnant water, but during a major flooding event, the situation seems more complex. How are mosquito populations and other vectors, like rats, which I also saw you study, affected by this kind of disaster? Could you tell us a bit about that? Do we tend to see an increase in disease cases afterward, or sometimes a decrease? How much does a disaster like this worsen the situation from a public health perspective?
Perfect. These types of extreme events, especially extreme precipitation events, end up leading to various consequences, both in the ecosystem and in the health of animals and humans, right? In this single health concept, which is the approach we work with a lot. Regarding human health, we observe that floods cause a greater risk of mixing between wastewater and river water and other types of water that are often used for food, for consumption, for preparing something. And these contaminants, which can range from leptospirosis, rotavirus, and other waterborne pathogens, can lead to gastroenteritis and other positive illnesses that increase significantly after these flood events. This occurrence happens very quickly. We see it a few days after the event occurs, with people, if they were exposed to this contaminated water, already developing certain conditions. As the water recedes and we enter a drier period, so to speak, where the rain has stopped, we see that in some places this water can become stagnant, trapped, and create breeding grounds for mosquitoes like Aedes aegypti. We also see that during these floods, there is a dragging of urban waste that can concentrate in some places and also be a breeding ground for mosquitoes and other vectors. And from there, we begin to see the accelerated reproduction of these mosquitoes and their circulation in these areas, where they may be carrying arboviruses, such as dengue, chikungunya, among others. So it also ends up being common, but not immediately, right? In the coming weeks, even the coming months, we see an increase in cases of dengue fever and these arboviruses because they depend on the mosquito breeding period after dispersal, so that people in the area become infected. So we see that the progression of certain diseases is temporally well defined. We have some diseases that appear more immediately after these events, and others that will emerge sometime later, but which have a very close relationship with that event that occurred recently in the history of that place. And we're only talking about precipitation events. If we look at drought events and ocean warming, we'll also see that other ecological imbalances occur. Fauna are displaced, and this favors closer contact with human populations where these pathogens jump from one species to another, which is what we call a zoonotic event, and we can then have outbreaks of other diseases. So, regarding ocean warming, we've already seen that it favors the proliferation of bacteria of the genus Vibrio, and among bacteria of this genus, we have increased transmission of cholera, which is a very serious disease, especially in children and the elderly. We also observe that other types of pathogens also begin to have a more accelerated presence. This issue of droughts and wildlife displacement can also favor other diseases ending up getting closer to us, and vice versa. We can also end up exposing other animals in some way, and we also have to remember that this path can also happen in the other direction. And all these imbalances in this ecosystem favor outbreaks of epidemics and even pandemics, depending on the immunity of the population in that location, the dispersion of the pathogen, and its characteristics. So, to a certain extent, we see, even from a recent published study, that more than half of known human zoonotic diseases have at some point been influenced by extreme events due to accelerated climate change. So, it's a very important reality that we have to be looking at, understanding what is favoring it, which variables are the most relevant for certain disease profiles. Even thinking about population resilience strategies, preventive approaches, and community engagement to mitigate the impact that these diseases will have on these populations.
That is very interesting because, in the context of the Prevent project, we are always thinking about how technology can be used to help in the prediction or mitigation of extreme weather events. One thing that we have realized is that the majority of the population is not trained to deal with these extreme weather events, which can be different types of natural disasters. What are the important things that an ordinary citizen should know that might help save lives in this context? What do you think?
Absolutely, Carlos. I think it's primarily the people, but also society itself. It's important that governments map out regions that will be used to create shelters, field hospitals, and field laboratories in disaster situations like this, and that the population is well informed about where they need to go when there's an alert. I think one of the main problems we have is in situations where the population needs to move to protect themselves. Sometimes people put themselves at even greater risk by doing so because they don't know which are the safe areas they need to go to. So it's important that governments have this planned in those neighborhoods that are the reference centers for a gymnasium or some facility in situations of flooding or other types of disasters like storms, etc., and have very well established in contingency plans where field hospitals and other types of facilities important for maintaining health and infrastructure will be installed. So it's very important that we have this level of preparedness and planning from local governments, and that the populations are very well informed about it. And as a citizen, it's very important that I already have in my mind, in my preparation, at least a small bag, a suitcase, something like that, packed with essential items, medications for continuous use that I can't stop taking. Changes of clothes, documents. We see that a lot of people lost their documents, prescriptions, and medications for continuous use during this time of emergency room visits because of the floods, right? So, this is sometimes very important so that the person can continue their treatment, not decompensate, and not need to be hospitalized as a consequence of this, right? So I think it's important to have a little kit, or at least keep in mind what the first things are that I need to grab when leaving in an emergency situation where I have to leave my residence quickly. And then, if you have children, the same thing. Children's documents, children's medicine, that kind of thing. I also think it's important that people try to organize their homes as much as possible in situations like this, trying to preserve the structure as much as possible. Often we see that some people manage to put furniture on top of structures to avoid getting it wet or something like that. So if there's more time before leaving and you can prepare your house for that moment, that could be an idea. But certainly the most important emergency items are those things that are indispensable to have with you wherever you go. And I also think that as far as possible, try to have these plans very well established in your head. Where I'm going, what channels I need to use, what I'm going to take with me. And from there, we as a society will see how the situation develops. But I believe so. I think I see this a lot now after this post-flood period, as people here in my region are a little more aware of this. Many people are already saying, if it happens again, I would do things differently. Or they rebuilt their houses thinking, and if it happens again, how can I, in short, preserve as much of this as possible? So we see that this has had a very big impact on the awareness of the population affected here in our region. But I still think that something is very disorganized, with very individual initiatives, when in fact we need those who organize and coordinate all of this to be government leaders, right? So I hope that we have not only a very well-defined contingency plan, but above all, awareness and assertive communication so that people can have access to this information and organize themselves. And in this case, there is the issue of the flood.
You do research on the topic of diseases and what typically happens after floods. Depending on the situation, of course, some cities were completely underwater. A large part of the city was underwater. Perhaps others rose to a certain level, a certain height. But at what point do people need to take care of themselves and worry so they don't, let's say, get sick? And perhaps these diseases lead them to think, oh, I forgot my wallet at home. There was a flood yesterday. So now, wow, I'm going to run over there because the water has receded reasonably. I'm going to run over there to get my wallet. Is there a risk in doing this of getting sick and bringing that disease to an entire hospital or center that was created to care for people and suddenly is making everyone sick and putting people at greater risk?
Without a doubt, it exists, Carlos. We're talking about different pathogens that can have different modes of transmission, right? So airborne transmission is much easier in that respect, but also if there's contamination through water or through the fecal-oral route, something like that. But mainly through the air, I think there's a risk of greater contamination within those spaces. We also have to remember that this is very conducive when we're talking about a shelter. A shelter usually has a large number of people crowded together. It's a favorable environment for the spread of respiratory pathogens, right? When we built the shelter here in our city, we took great care with this, testing people with flu-like symptoms, mapping for tuberculosis, which is something with a great impact. In our region here in Rio Grande do Sul, our averages are higher than the national averages. So it's a very relevant public health problem for us. We took care to test patients and isolate them in specific places, specific shelters for these patients. So it's very important that we take this care, and even thinking about accidents that aren't necessarily transmissible. But when we have this type of flood phenomenon, there's a displacement of fauna. Animals also move to look for safer, drier places. An example of this was something I experienced myself, which was when we opened our house after it had been flooded for weeks, with water over 2 meters high for weeks. It's something other people also experienced. We found dead snakes in cupboards. So they were probably snakes that had moved from other flooded areas and were trying to find somewhere safe, somewhere drier, because animals are also doing the same thing we are, looking for shelter, looking for a dry, safe place. So in that case, they were dead, probably due to the circumstances of the event. But imagine if they were alive, it could already be a point of potential accident if they have any venom. We also saw that when rescuing animals, some bites happen, right? And we don't know if that animal is vaccinated or scratches, licks, we don't know. So a lot of rabies and tetanus prophylaxis was also done at that time, right? Well, so we see that accidents don't uncommon during these moments. So it's important that we also have a very well-coordinated plan for how to do this, how to carry out this rescue, and soon coordinate specific teams to do this. Of course, the event that occurred here in our state was unprecedented, so there wasn't time to coordinate specific teams for that emergency. But today, knowing that this has passed and that it will probably happen again, perhaps not on this scale or perhaps even on an even worse scale, depending, it's important that we review everything that happened and identify all the points that we could improve, that we could already have some established protocol that we could mitigate, that we could soon have a database of volunteers and their expertise to quickly activate them in such a situation, for example. Right? So I think there's a lot to be done, yes, and sometimes I'm worried about the inertia itself, how long it's taking for us to establish these flows. Because if we stop to think about it, the flood I'm referring to happened in 2024, but in 2025 we had floods again. Especially in the island region, in the region of some rivers that have already flooded more than once, in 2023, 2024, and again in 2025. So we've had 3 consecutive years of extreme flood events of greater or lesser scope in the state here in Rio Grande do Sul. In 2026, we'll probably have another one or others. So how long are we going to continue reacting without having these protocols established? It's a very delicate situation, but one that really requires the attention of everyone involved. And I think especially, as you said, of the leadership, particularly the government. because even if there are NGOs acting, they usually have a limited scope of power or even civil associations. One thing I was going to ask you, which we were even discussing before, is that we are seeing these events happening in Rio Grande do Sul.
But based on the research you've been developing with your research group, do you think it's possible to use the results you're collecting, analyzing, and discovering and learn from results from other locations that have, let's say, similar climatic and geographical characteristics?
Absolutely. We were even discussing amongst ourselves how the research we've been doing has shown an arrival of certain arboviruses here in our southern region, which is a region with a slightly more temperate climate compared to other regions further north in the country, and how this might resemble a phenomenon that other truly temperate countries are experiencing, such as the arrival of arboviruses in the United States, Europe, and Canada. So we see that there are certain similarities, or rather certain climatic triggers, of climatic variables that may be acting both here in our southern region and in this more northern region. Therefore, this identification is fundamental so that we can share these experiences as an academic community. This allows everyone to respond better depending on these circumstances, which will be specific to the location, but at the same time, they can share essential triggers that are very important to diagnose so that we can think about public policies that will truly benefit the affected populations, both in the pre-crisis phase and in the crisis and post-crisis phases.
Interesting. Now regarding the technologies that exist that people use during perhaps the pre-crisis, the crisis, or even the post-crisis, do you think that current technologies are meeting the needs? Are there things that are missing? Are you developing anything in that sense of technology as well to help in any of these various areas to combat the events or the post-event consequences?
Perfect. We have quite a few interesting initiatives here in our state, even looking at our future scenario of extreme precipitation events, but also droughts, among others. And here at our research center, we have been developing technologies embedded in chips for the detection of pathogens in environmental samples to make things easier. Because one of the things we realized was that during these extreme events, many laboratories and health institutions were available to perform tests and analyses. And with the highways interrupted and flooded, it became very difficult for us to send samples or receive supplies and even donations. So, one of the things we also seek to establish is to create technologies that can be applied locally, that can provide important answers. For example, if in that artesian well, does it have leptospirosis? Does it have Escherichia coli? Does it have any important known contaminant that could cause an outbreak of gastrointestinal disease in those people who will be consuming that water? So we are trying to think about and develop prototypes that help with these solutions so that we can bring these answers more readily available to professionals, considering contexts where locations with adequate equipment will not be available, as was exactly what we experienced during the floods of 2024 and also in 2023 in the cities that were most affected. Furthermore, we have also been trying to build epidemiological intelligence from machine learning algorithms, from predictions, to try to estimate in some way the populations potentially affected in a given area, where these populations may be more or less vulnerable to these events, in order to think about public policies for these locations and try to make the most of the resources that are being allocated for this, so that they are applied in places that are actually vulnerable to these climate issues that are being caused. So, we've been working on several fronts. Just one example of what we as a core group are doing. If we were to think about all the other laboratories and reference centers in the state, we would see that many interesting things are emerging within the technology parks of public and private universities, and from research institutes within the industry itself, in partnership with academia. So, I think what we really need is more and more investment, more calls for proposals, more resources directed towards this, in order to accelerate these mitigation plans with innovative technologies that will allow us to respond better in our next extreme event.
As we are nearing the end of our episode today, is there anything else you'd like to share with us that you consider important before we wrap up? Anything you'd like to talk about or comment on?
I wanted to express my gratitude for this opportunity. I think it's great that we're strengthening these relationships, especially between countries, between institutions, and between areas of expertise. I think this shows how essential the One Health approach is for uniting these people and connecting these various fronts, bringing them closer together. These different perspectives allow us to have something more integrated, and that truly reflects our reality. And I wanted to make myself available for anything that I and our group can be useful for. Because I think there's no such thing as a problem in this country, a problem in our country, a global problem. And today it may be knocking on my door, but nothing prevents other problems, or this same one, from knocking on yours as well. So the more we strive to collaborate, share, and join forces so that we can mutually enhance the advancement of science, the more we will be able to find solutions that will be comprehensive and will help people and populations from different regions. I think that over the last few years, we have learned how, in fact, the world is a very small place indeed. Our distances are much smaller than we imagined, and these events are much more far-reaching than we imagined as well. And the planet's climate has been changing considerably at a much faster rate than we imagined 50 years ago, for example. There are many projections that were planned for decades ahead of today, and we are already seeing a reflection of what we thought would only happen later. So, looking at this scenario and also considering that our predictions are not the most optimistic, the issue of mitigating the planet's average temperature from 1.5 degrees Celsius is no longer part of our reality. We will not be able to limit global warming to that range. We already see how uneasy and, above all, complex our situation is. Therefore, it is very important that we, as academics, as professors, and as science popularizers, have this engagement, even to hold decision makers accountable for what needs to be done, for the decisions that have to be made both within and outside of co-ops, both within and outside of extreme events, because the response to the event begins before the event happens. So it's very important that we start this soon, and I think this approach is a fundamental step towards that.
I agree. I think it's really important to be having these conversations. And interdisciplinarity is fundamental for us to actually tackle real problems that we face as a society. If people want to follow your work, how can they reach you?
Okay, I'm going to leave my social media accounts here because our group is still being structured. We don't have a page yet. But on my social media, I talk a lot about One Health and other public health issues. All my usernames are at Melziland, Mellziand. So you can find me on any social media platform with that username. I mainly use Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, but I also have Blue Sky and other platforms as well. And I invite you to follow this work and also keep this dialogue open with me, because I'm always open to suggestions for anything I can do to clarify something or produce content that makes sense and is relevant to someone.
All right, thank you very much for today. For me, it was very inspirational, and I hope this episode helps students and teachers who will be listening to this episode of the Prevent podcast. Until next time, everyone,